You cut the wine. You cut the bread. You started tracking everything, every bite, every gram, hired the trainer, followed the exact plan that worked at 35. And nothing moved. Not the scale, not the waist, not the energy. Quietly, you started telling yourself the problem was you. I need to stop you right there. Because I have been sitting across from women exactly like you for 30 years, and that conclusion is wrong. Here is what nobody handed you. Estradiol, the hormone that regulates your insulin sensitivity, your fat storage, how your body uses fuel, drops roughly 95% in the postmenopausal window. 8 out of 10 of the OB/GYNs you have trusted have never received formal training in what that means for your metabolism. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching this from. I want to know how far this conversation is reaching. I read every single one. The story you have been given by the diet programs, the wellness articles, the plans titled "The One Eating Mistake Holding You Back" says this is a behavioral problem, a carb you didn't cut, a macro you got wrong, more disciplined. That conclusion is clinically wrong. 3 out of 4 women in menopause receive no hormonal assessment at all because the doctors sitting across from them had no training to explain what was actually happening. What I am going to show you today is not another eating plan. It is the actual physiological mechanism your body went through, and the full revelation that reframes every failed plan you ever blamed yourself for, I am saving for the end. You cut the wine. You cut the bread. You started tracking everything, every bite, every gram, hired the trainer, followed the exact plan that worked at 35. And nothing moved. Not the scale, not the waist, not the energy. Quietly, you started telling yourself the problem was you. I need to stop you right there. Because I have been sitting across from women exactly like you for 30 years, and that conclusion is wrong. Here is what nobody handed you. Estradiol, the hormone that regulates your insulin sensitivity, your fat storage, how your body actually uses fuel, drops roughly 95% in the postmenopausal window. 8 out of 10 of the OB/GYNs you have trusted have never received formal training in what that means for your metabolism. And before I go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching this from. I want to know how far this conversation is reaching. I read every single one. The story you have been given by the diet programs, the wellness articles, the plans with titles like "The One Eating Mistake Holding You Back" says this is a behavioral problem, a carb you didn't cut, a macro you got wrong, more disciplined. That conclusion is clinically wrong, and it has cost an entire generation of women years of self-blame they never deserved. 3 out of 4 women in menopause receive no hormonal assessment whatsoever because the doctors sitting across from them had no framework to explain what was actually happening. What I am going to walk you through today is the actual physiological mechanism, the one that makes every failed plan finally make sense. The silence ends in this room. And the full picture of what happened inside your body, the part that reframes everything you ever tried, I am holding until the end. Because once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Here is the part that still makes me quiet when I think about it. In 2002, a federal study, the Women's Health Initiative, published findings that were misread and then broadcast in every major newspaper in the country. Hormone therapy was suddenly portrayed as dangerous. Prescriptions dropped by 80% in the years that followed. An entire generation of women entered menopause without treatment, without clinical support, without conversation. The metabolic consequences of that panic were never publicly explained. Nobody came back to correct the record. That silence, the one that started in a press release in 2002, is still running. And what it cost women in the decades since? I will get to that. Because it is not a small number, and it lands in your body, not in a statistic. And before that, your mother. Think about her for a moment. She did not have the word perimenopause. She had the change, a phrase designed to end conversations, not open them. She gained weight, lost sleep, felt moods she couldn't name, and the culture told her to lower her voice about all of it. Her doctor told her it was normal aging. She believed him. She told you nothing, not because she wanted to withhold it, but because she genuinely had nothing to pass down. What she inherited from her own mother was silence. And silence is exactly what she handed to you. Not out of cruelty, out of having nothing else. Then there is the training problem, and I want to be precise here because this is documented, not opinion. The average U.S. medical school includes less than 2 hours of menopause-specific curriculum in its entire program. 2 hours. And most of the metabolic research that shaped your doctor's understanding of how women's bodies process food was built on data from men or from younger women, because women over 50 were routinely excluded from clinical trials until federal policy changed that in 1993. The framework your doctor uses to evaluate your symptoms was built without you in it. In a few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what that means when you sit down in that office, because the consequence of that exclusion did not stay in the research journals. It came home with you. Look, nobody sat in a room and decided to mislead you. That is not what happened. What happened is more frustrating, honestly, because it means the problem is structural. The diet and wellness industry, worth $18.31 billion in 2025, built specifically around women in your demographic, had a clear commercial reason to keep this framed as behavioral. A behavioral problem sells products. A hormonal reality requires a doctor who was actually trained to address it. Only one of those is scalable. And on the medical side, postmenopausal metabolic dysfunction was never integrated into standard training in a way that gave your physician the clinical language to connect what she was seeing in front of her to what was happening inside you. She may have genuinely meant well. She simply was not equipped. And the industry had no incentive to close that gap. The women left in the middle of all of this were not a small group. More than 1.1 million women enter menopause in the United States every single year, more than 6,000 every single day, and most of them arrive at that transition with no hormonal baseline, no metabolic assessment, and a stack of behavioral recommendations designed for a physiology they no longer have. The result is not just frustration. It is measurable, biological change occurring in tissues you cannot see or feel on a timeline nobody explained. And what I need to show you next is the exact mechanism, the cascade that begins when estrogen loses its regulatory grip, not on your mood, not on your sleep, but on the metabolic machinery itself. Because once you understand what is actually being governed and what stops being governed, you will stop asking what you did wrong. You will start asking a completely different question. Here is the part that most doctors never mapped for you. Estrogen is not a reproductive hormone that happens to affect your mood on the side. It is a systemic regulatory signal, and your body has estrogen receptors in over 400 tissues. The liver, skeletal muscle, pancreatic beta cells, fat cells themselves. the hypothalamus, which sets your metabolic baseline. When estradiol withdrew, it did not affect one system. It withdrew its signal from all of them simultaneously, on the same timeline. And what happens next, inside the fat cell specifically, when that governing signal goes dark, is not what any diet plan or wellness article ever prepared you for. And then there is the brain. This part is harder to hear, and I want to be precise about it. Estrogen directly facilitates serotonin synthesis and dopamine receptor sensitivity, not as a side effect, as a primary function. Research in Nature Reviews Neuroscience documented that estrogen withdrawal measurably alters hypothalamic neuropeptide Y activity, the pathway that regulates your hunger and satiety feedback. That is why the portion that felt satisfying at 42 no longer registers as enough at 54. Not because your appetite changed on its own, because the neurochemical loop that governed it lost its hormonal anchor. In 30 years of practice, I have seen this exact pattern thousands of times. And before I go any further, I want to tell you something I do not usually say out loud. I went through this myself. I was 53. I still remember the exact morning, barely 5:30, still dark, sitting at my own kitchen table before anyone else was up, 3 weeks of careful eating behind me, and not one thing had moved. Not the scale, not how I felt. I was a physician. I had every tool. I still didn't connect what was happening in my own body to the cascade I had explained to hundreds of patients before me. I finally ordered my own labs, and what I found, starting with testosterone, a hormone almost never tested in women, changed the picture entirely. Because it is never one hormone. It is every declining signal compounding at once. Let me explain what is actually happening in your body, the precise sequence, not the shorthand. After your final period, insulin resistance increases between 30 and 50% within the first 5 years. Not because of anything you changed. That figure comes from Clinical Endocrinology, 2021, and it is independent of dietary intake. Think about what that means. The same food, the same calories, the same effort, and your muscle tissue is now up to half as responsive to the signal that should be opening the door and letting fuel in. That is not a willpower problem. That is a receptor problem. And here is where it compounds, because this is never one thing. Cortisol, your primary stress hormone, rises measurably when estrogen declines, because estrogen previously suppressed what is called HPA-axis hyperactivity. Elevated cortisol directly instructs your body to store fat centrally, around the organs, deep in the abdomen. Studies in the NAMS journal Menopause found visceral abdominal fat increasing 25 to 40% in untreated postmenopause in women who maintained identical caloric intake. You were not eating more. Your hormones were filing different instructions. I want to tell you about a patient. I will call her Carol. She came in about 18 months ago. She sat down across from me, folded her hands in her lap, and said, very quietly, "I feel like I'm doing everything right and getting punished for it. Like my body turned against me, and I don't know what I did." Those were her exact words. She had been restricting calories for 2 years, lost 11 pounds initially, then gained back 14. She was walking 45 minutes every morning. I ran a full panel, fasting insulin, estradiol, cortisol, free testosterone, and what came back showed significant insulin resistance alongside low estrogen and elevated morning cortisol. I told her, "Your body did not turn against you. It lost the hormonal infrastructure that made your previous approach work, and then it started responding to chronic caloric restriction as a metabolic stress, which cortisol interprets as a reason to hold on to every reserve it has. And then there is the metabolic rate itself, a layer that almost never gets explained. Resting metabolic rate decreases with age, roughly 50 to 100 calories per day per decade, but that figure is significantly amplified post-menopause because of estrogen's thermogenic and insulin-sensitizing effects now largely absent. A 2023 study in Cell Metabolism found that postmenopausal women oxidize fat at meaningfully lower rates during low-intensity exercise than premenopausal women at equivalent effort, not because of fitness differences, but hormonal ones. So the morning walks that used to metabolize fuel are now operating on a different biochemical substrate. Here is the part that should make you stop blaming every food decision you made for the past decade. Your strategy was not wrong. The dietary choices that produced results at 40 were sound choices for a woman whose hormones could make them sufficient. They stopped working not because the logic broke, but because the hormonal infrastructure those choices relied on is operating at a fraction of its previous capacity. You did not fail the plan. The plan failed the body you have now because it was designed for the hormonal environment of a woman at 35. Someone in the clinical system you trusted had the information, had the appointment, had the moment, and let you walk out without it. And that is where the quiet anger should sit. Not at yourself, at the silence. When your weight didn't move, that was not a character flaw. When your energy collapsed, it was not weakness. And when you stopped recognizing your own body in the mirror, that is not aging. That is a hormone shift nobody explained to you. Here is what happens in the first 3 years if nothing changes. Vasomotor symptoms, the night sweats, the sudden heat pulling you out of sleep at 2 in the morning, do not simply resolve on their own. Research shows half of untreated women experience them for 7 years or longer. 7 years of fragmented sleep erodes working memory, executive function, emotional regulation, systematically, measurably. The fog you are living inside right now, the one you keep describing as not feeling like myself, is neurological consequence accumulating in real time. And then there is this psychological cost. Anxiety is reported by roughly 70% of women moving through this transition. Depression rates double in perimenopause compared to the reproductive years. The most corrosive consequence, though, is the one you carry privately, the belief that everyone around you is managing this just fine, that your struggle is something personal, a character flaw dressed up as a symptom. Move past 3 years, and what was functional becomes structural. Women lose up to 20% of their total bone density in the first 5 to 7 years following the final menstrual period, not across a lifetime, in that window. It is the critical intervention period, and most women pass through it without a single bone density conversation, without any scan. Genitourinary syndrome, the vaginal and urinary tissue changes that almost nobody warned you about, does not resolve on its own. It progresses. Cardiovascular protection erodes silently alongside it. And then the long horizon. 1 in 2 women over 50 will experience an osteoporosis-related fracture in her lifetime, more women affected than by breast cancer and stroke combined, and almost nobody mentions it as a clinical priority at the beginning of menopause. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in women over 60, not cancer. Heart disease, The metabolic disruption seated in untreated early postmenopause is one of its primary drivers. Tell me in the comments, which of these consequences is the one nobody warned you about? Maybe it was the bones. Maybe it was the cardiovascular risk you had never thought to connect to estrogen. Maybe it was the cognitive fog that has been quietly frightening you for months. Leave it below. I read every one. So here is what you actually do tomorrow. Not a mindset. Language, the specific words that change how that appointment goes. When you sit down, you ask this: Doctor, have you completed any continuing education in menopause management in the last 5 years? Watch the answer. It tells you everything. Then you say, I'd like to request a full hormone panel: estradiol, progesterone, free testosterone, and thyroid, not just TSH. If weight is not moving, add fasting insulin to that list. If you are over 50 and no one has ever discussed your bones, you say, I would like a DEXA scan. Those are standard clinical tools. And if you hear your labs look fine for your age, which you may, you do not leave without saying this exactly: I understand my results may fall within standard range. I am experiencing weight changes, disrupted sleep, and cognitive fog, and I would like these investigated as potential hormonal causes, not attributed to stress or normal aging. That sentence does not accuse anyone. It closes the exit they have been using to end the conversation before it starts. If your current provider cannot meet you there, look for someone who is NAMS certified. The North American Menopause Society keeps a provider directory. This is hard. I want to say that plainly. You are asking a system that failed you to suddenly serve you, and you are doing it while already exhausted, already frustrated, already carrying years of self-blame that was never yours to carry. But now you have the language the system responds to. Every diet that didn't work was not evidence of your weakness. It was evidence of a framework that was wrong from the beginning. What changes today is not your body. It is your position in the room. The silence ends in this room. Not as a tagline, as a commitment this channel keeps every week. What I showed you today is one layer, but there is a layer under this one. The question I haven't answered yet is the one that will stay with you. If the old rules no longer apply to your body, what does? Not a protocol borrowed from research on women 20 years younger. The actual metabolic conditions that shift when you stop working against your own physiology. That is the next conversation. And I think you already sense you need it. Before you go, tell me what clicked for you today. Leave a comment below. Maybe it was the first time someone in a clinical context named what was actually happening instead of handing you more discipline. Maybe it was realizing that every plan you tried was technically sound for a woman with a different hormonal profile. Maybe it was something smaller, just hearing that the gap was real, that the silence was real, and that you were not imagining any of it. Whatever it was, share it below. Those words reach further than you know, and I read every single one. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.